In my opinion, every great movie has one really great scene. The Dark Knight's interrogation scene, I Am Your Father from The Empire Strikes Back, and Lord of the Rings, of course, has You Shall Not Pass. There's always that one scene that comes to mind when we think of a movie, and we've had no shortage of these in recent years, whether from animated hits or live-action masterpieces. Many great movies have had that one moment that stays with you forever. Joel and Ethan Coen's No Country for Old Men, released in 2007, is a masterclass in tension, tone, and cinematography. And while this film has many amazing scenes, I think this movie's crowning achievement is the gas station scene, an iconic scene that stands as a perfect microcosm of the entire movie. Today I want to try to break down what makes the scene great and how it became a legendary scene. But first, a bit of context. The movie's main character, Llewellyn Moss, comes across the remains of the site of a drug deal gone wrong, and with it $2 million. Having stolen the money, Llewellyn finds himself being chased by a cruel, cold-hearted killer, Anton Chigurh. There's another couple of characters, but them and Llewellyn aren't particularly relevant for the sake of this video, so let's take a look at possibly the most chilling scene Chigurh takes part in this entire movie. This scene, geniusly, is divided into 3 relatively equal acts. The second is a little longer than the first and the third, but it really doesn't matter because it still follows this relatively strict, common narrative structure. We begin, as you would expect, with Act 1. Let's start with the opening shot, our setting, an 80s Texaco gas station. We cut to the inside of the adjacent building where the proprietor, played by Gene Jones, stands writing something in a notepad. Seems to him like a normal day at the office, as it were. Chigurh, played by Javier Bardem, asks how much for the cashews he's buying. The camera cuts to Chigurh, establishing the second half of this now iconic duo and our second main camera angle. There are a few others, but these are the first 2 that we'll be using. This scene is quite binary yet clever in its cinematography, and we'll get a lot from it soon. Our scene is set. We have our 2 characters and our setting. Chigurh formally asks, "And the gas?" showing that he's in control of the dialogue from the get-go. The proprietor makes a casual comment about the weather, which is his first mistake.
Y'all getting any rain up your way?
This question piques Chigurh's curiosity as he pauses and looks up and asks,
"What way would that be?"
The proprietor replies.
I seen you was from Dallas.
The camera stays on Chigurh this whole time as he looks the proprietor up and down while eating the cashews, which, by the way, he hasn't even paid for. It's a simple but effective way of setting the tone and establishing control of the scene, that Chigurh is controlling all of the dialogue. He never loses control, showing his power over the scene and thus the proprietor.
"What business is it of yours? Where I'm from? Friendo."
And here we have the first malicious part of the scene that really sets the tone. The other aspects help set the control scheme of this scene, but this is the first alarm bell that should sound in our head. The cinematography here is great and minimalistic like the rest of the film, which I'll mention a few times in this video. Only really relying on 2 angles with a dark setting, with some very harsh shadows that emphasize the tone of this scene. The camera cuts to the proprietor halfway through Chigurh's sentence to show how this registers with us. We then go back to Chigurh, who makes the word friendo sound absolutely terrifying. We cut back to the proprietor, who's stunned for a moment and then replies.
I didn't mean nothing by it.
Chigurh mockingly repeats the sentence, and the man gives his justification. He was just trying to pass the time. We briefly go back to Chigurh, who stares at the proprietor while he explains himself. Now notice the way the proprietor's eyes quickly move. This is a nice little detail that Gene Jones adds to show that the proprietor is very nervous. There's a silence which is punctuated by Chigurh's own lack of input. The proprietor now seems to be hurrying this interaction along, asking if Chigurh wants anything else. Chigurh responds with a simple 5-word sentence.
Might be something else.
"I don't know. Will there?"
This is the turning point where the tone shifts again from apprehensive to worrying. It may come off as just another sentence, but here we see that Anton's mind is starting to shift. It's an understated moment that shows us that the tone of the scene has completely changed to a life or death situation, which we'll see later and that the proprietor is unaware of. We, the audience, should take note of this as a key turning point in this scene. The proprietor nervously clears his throat and asks Chigurh if there's something wrong. Great acting here again. We see Gene Jones look away before asking the question, angling his face down, showing that he doesn't want confrontation. Chigurh replies, "With what?" This is probably the faintest stutter of emotion we see from Chigurh. It's very artificial and almost slightly mocking. The proprietor continues, "With anything." Chigurh then fires back with this line.
Is that what you're asking me? Is there something wrong with anything?
There's another hint of silent mockery in this sentence. Chigurh then smiles almost evilly, showing his disdain for the poor proprietor. The aforementioned asks again, will there be anything else, which Chigurh immediately picks up on.
Will there be anything else?
You already asked me that.
This is another example of the proprietor trying to move the encounter along, clearly showing how uncomfortable he is. There's a long silence which feels like an age before the proprietor makes yet another mistake.
Well, I need to see about closing them.
This is where the proprietor completely loses any ground he had in this verbal discussion. He completely resigns from the encounter, trying to stop it by backing out. Chigurh doesn't take this though and pushes the proprietor, asking what time he closes. The proprietor then says around dark, gesturing outside to the broad daylight. He's so nervous he's almost lost his senses. The gesture outside is a great way of showing how afraid and uncomfortable he is. Chigurh stares at him, then takes a deep breath.
You don't know what you're talking about, do you?
This is another turning point in the scene and an important one. This is a crucial moment and it's where Chigurh takes over completely. The fact that the camera doesn't cut back to the proprietor shows us that Chigurh is the focus of this moment and that he's controlling the scene. The proprietor simply asks, "Sir?" To which Anton replies by repeating the earlier statement. We cut back to the proprietor, who just stares at Chigurh in astonishment. This is a strange line of dialogue in that there's not much narrative meaning to this. He's just trying to assert his dominance on the verbal plane, which he has done masterfully already. The proprietor once again replies with a confused "sir," to which Anton replies sternly.
You're a bit deaf, aren't you? I said, what time do you go to bed?
This is another rare show of emotion from Anton, and it's chilling. The proprietor stammers out his reply of 9:30. Anton replies, stating he could return then, to which the proprietor reacts the same way I did.
Why would you be coming back? We'll be closed.
The proprietor then tries a third time to shut off the encounter by telling Anton he is closing after a very long pause. Anton then asks this question.
You lived here all your life?
The proprietor replies, all while the camera still stays on Anton, highlighting once again that he is in complete control by keeping the focus on him. Anton then asks another strange question at first glance.
You lived here all your life?
The proprietor then gives Anton some brief family lore, to which Anton responds by choking on the cashew he's eating out of shock and maybe a hint of disgust. He then asks, "You married into it?" The camera once again cuts back to the proprietor, who looks shocked and then gives Anton some more information on how he came to the station from Temple, Texas, having raised a family there. This could be just an artifact of the speed, but notice the way he repeats Temple. He repeats himself, which is the immediate giveaway that he isn't really that sure of himself and he's nervous.
We lived in Temple, Texas for many years. Raised a family there. In Temple.
Anton, instead of asking, this time makes a statement.
You married into it?
It's his last big line of dialogue before we dive into the scene's phenomenal third act, and it's fitting.
That's the way you want to put it.
The proprietor smiles to himself. Now, notice how the camera zooms in on it. This tells us that it's something important since it's a change from the usual to relatively zoomed out angles where we can see both parties involved. It's clearly he's trying to laugh off what is quite a hurtful statement, which is probably what most people would do in this scenario, I think. It's also possible he's thinking of the aforementioned family, but this is less likely, although not entirely implausible. Chigurh simply replies,
I don't have some way to put it. That's the way it is.
Again, notice how the camera is zoomed in. This makes Chigurh fill out the frame and not only makes him more imposing and menacing while keeping the same dark shadows, but also creates a sense of him closing in and fills us with dread. Chigurh sighs and puts down the wrapper of the cashews, which again, he ate before even paying for them. Chad. This shot of the cashew wrapper uncrumpling is very important and it's quite telling. It first ushers us into the third act of this so far really great scene. It also shows, as it were, the way this encounter is rapidly unraveling and going off the rails. The sound doesn't do much by itself, but what it does do is draw your attention to what's been missing this whole time. Music. This scene's complete lack of music is incredible, and it becomes jarring at this point. The uncrumpling is also a really interesting way of showing us that the small talk of the scene is over now that Chigurh has finished his near interrogation of this poor man. And lastly, it's a brief breath of fresh air from the binary cinematography. Not that this is a bad thing, but you do need a break, and this dose of color is very welcome in such a dark and dingy scene. Now that we've covered the bridging shot, as I like to think of it, let's talk about the part of the scene that makes it really great. The infamous coin flip. Chigurh asks this now iconic question.
What's the most you ever lost on a coin toss?
This sets the stage for the primary focal point of this act, a single coin flip. He tells us through this that this is where our friend the proprietor may lose his life on this flip. It's simple but effective. Sir, and a repetition of the previous statement follows suit, except notice how Chigurh cuts his repetition down a bit. This shows that Chigurh is starting to get quite annoyed, and to be fair to him, if I had to repeat myself this many times, I'd be getting ratty too. He's almost whispering, and yet it's so chilling. Great delivery by Javier Bardem. The silence is tangible, the tension is so thick you could cut it with a knife. The proprietor replies.
I don't know. I couldn't say.
From a dialogue point of view, there isn't much here. It's more just to facilitate Chigurh's next action. We cut back to Chigurh, flipping the coin all while keeping his eyes on it. He doesn't blink. He then slams the coin down on the desk, giving us another glimpse at the cashew packet that showed us earlier that this is where the scene began to go off the rails. We return to this angle with the situation now dire, having spiraled out of control to the point where, let me remind you, the proprietor's life currently relies on a literal 50-50. Chigurh sighs and says this line.
Call it.
He seems troubled. We can tell from the sigh and long blink. It's possible that he knows what the outcome will be, as he can feel the coin under his fingers. When the proprietor once more repeats, call it, nervously, notice that Chigurh doesn't actually repeat his sentence. He's completely done with the exchange. The focus, strangely, here is not on the proprietor, but on Chigurh. The camera's zoomed back out, however, so the proprietor is still very much in our field of vision, and is still, mentally speaking, playing a part in this scene. We don't see his immediate reaction until later. The proprietor rightfully asks,
Well, we need to know what we're calling it for here.
to which Anton quietly replies, just call it. The proprietor can't stall anymore. He is now in this definitive life or death situation that relies on a perfect 50-50. It's hard to illustrate what an impact this has on someone at first viewing. It's terrifying yet entertaining. It's chilling and yet so completely enrapturing. He's just been randomly confronted with this situation in which he doesn't understand the full consequences of this choice. This is a fundamental part of why this scene is so tense, because we know what could happen, whereas one party on the screen, the proprietor in this case, does not. This coin flip is a great example of the black box, a concept of a system whose internal workings are unknown. In this sense, the proprietor doesn't understand the workings of this coin toss and the impact it may have on his and his family. We might also want to note the almost painful irony of the smiley face stickers that hang around in the background. The third act continues further with the proprietor stating that he needs to know what he's calling the coin for. This is a very valid question, however, Chigurh ignores it, simply saying,
You need to call it.
The proprietor states he didn't put anything on it, to which Chigurh replies with this famous line.
Yes, you did. You've been putting it up your whole life. You just didn't know it. You know what date is on this coin?
No?
1958. It's been traveling 22 years to get here. And now it's here.
There's so much in this set of sentences that it kind of warrants a video of its own. It's really difficult to interpret, and I struggled it a lot. Listen closer to Chigurh's line, but don't listen to him. Listen to the background.
1958. It's been traveling 22 years to get here. And now it's here. And it's either heads or tails.
That's right. The faintest yet most effective use of music in the whole movie. This near silent band of strings really elevates the tension of the scene to new levels. The proprietor, perhaps in an effort to shed light on what he might lose, asks what he stands to gain. Chigurh brilliantly replies,
You stand to win everything, call it.
This says so much about these consequences. I suppose you could relate it to Newton's third law of motion. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. You could see the coin flip as the action and life or death as the equal and opposite reactions respectively. Saying that he stands to win everything shows us that he could very well lose everything too. The proprietor asks how he would stand to win everything. Anton sternly replies himself one more time. There's yet another silence. The proprietor, who seems so innocent, kind, and hardworking, makes his final choice.
All right. Heads then.
There's a nail-biting silence that feels like an age. Chigurh slowly turns down to look at the coin and takes his hand away. Heads. And breathe. Chigurh congratulates the proprietor on what was basically RNG. He then drops some change on the counter. Chad paying for oil given the prices. It's crazy how fast this little exchange occurs compared to how drawn out the rest was, in a good way. It's a great change in pace and changes the tone to complete relief for the rest of us and the poor man who just unknowingly escaped the clutches of death. By the way, notice how the camera zooms in on the proprietor's still baffled face. This is again to highlight that he's still confused. But before he leaves, Anton leaves us with one more irritatingly vague statement.
Don't put it in your pocket, it's your lucky quarter.
Where you want me to put it?
Anywhere not in your pocket. Or it'll get mixed in with the others and become just a coin. Which it is.
This statement is very hard to understand, like the rest of the film. It's, I suppose, a way for the proprietor to remember this day. Maybe a lucky charm. I honestly have no clue. If you have any alternative interpretations, feel free to drop them in the comments. Chigurh exits, and we cut back to a new angle, a more zoomed out shot of the counter with the proprietor. Funnily enough, an almost copy and paste the establishing shot, although a great deal has changed. In conclusion, the gas station scene is a masterclass in minimalism. It's a tribute to simple, effective dialogue, a superbly tense moment that's shown through the most shockingly simple cinematography. It's a microcosm of the entire film, a brilliant story full of tension, ingenious pacing, and an eerily quiet background that makes these iconic moments all the better. The Coen brothers have created one of the most unforgettable scenes of all time, in my opinion. A stalwart bulwark of pure cinema that remains in our thoughts to this very